Okay, so we made it to the end of this chapter. We're in the last section. We have covered a lot. You have learned a lot over these last few weeks. You've worked very hard. You should be proud of yourself because you have put in the time and the effort. But we're not done yet. We have quite a bit to still cover. But if you are new to this channel and you would like to follow along with our curriculum, the link is in the description. So let's get into it. Validations with JavaScript. Validating form inputs before submitting the form can make the user experience much smoother. Some input types have built-in browser validation for basic formats, such as numbers and email addresses. We can use event handlers to perform more complex validation on form input values. Form inputs and the DOM. Before we can validate what the user has typed, we need to understand how to use form inputs with the DOM. Remember that the DOM is a JavaScript representation of the HTML document. Input tags can be selected and referenced like any other HTML element. To read the value of an input, we can check the value attribute. We can also assign a new value to the input.value, which will update the value shown in the input. So this is an example with log the value of an input, update the input's value, and then log it again when the button is clicked. So here we have our boilerplate, our HTML head and our body. So we have this form tag. Open and closing right here. This is the form right there. And inside of that form we have our label, which is the language, and then we have the input. It's the type is text, the name language. We have an ID, which is language, and we have a value, which is JavaScript. Now the button ID update, and this is the update input value. Now, remember when I was asking you, how does this work? How is this button able to be connecting to this particular form, this input? Is that what we're talking about? Well, let's see. So we want to update the input value. We have the script, and here's the open and closing tab of the script for our JavaScript. Now inside of our JavaScript, we have what? A button, let button. Remember, this is a variable. We're passing it the document get element by ID update. So we're getting access to that ID. Now we want to add event handlers for when button is clicked. So now button, which is connected to this ID, which is connected to this button element, button.add event listener. When it's clicked, then it's going to run this function. So now this is when it gets invoked right here. Once it's clicked, then this function is invoked. That's how event listeners work. Inside of this function, we have another variable that we created called the input get document element by ID language right here. So now this input has access to this input that's inside this form. Then we're going to console log input.value. Now update the value in the input. So input.value, this is a property, right? Because there's no parentheses around it. So we want to get access to that particular property, which up here it's an attribute. So it's connecting to this particular value here. Input.value, and then we want to add rocks. So we're concatenated rocks. And so console.log input.value now. Now what happens when you click the button multiple times? Do that. We want you to see what results do you get. What happens? See, this is how I learned with my programming. I just play around with the code. I do different things. I move things out, take them out of scope. What happened? Because once you really understand different variations of it, that just enhances your understanding. Now, steps to add validation. Add an event handler for the window now, load event. Within the Windows load handler, add an event handler for the form submit event. Retrieve input values that need to be validated from the DOM. Within the form submit handler, check the input values using conditional statements. If the values are valid, allow the form submission. If the values are not valid, inform the user and stop form submission. We're just adding layers here. Each of these steps involve additional details, which we will now break down. So here's the example. Let's start this by showing an alert box from the submit event is triggered. So here we have our basic head, we have some title, we have our styles in the head. Now we're adding the JavaScript. We're pulling in the script tag. We're putting this script tag inside of the file, locally inside this file, inline basically. So we're doing the window.add event listener. Once it loads, then this function is going to run. So let form document.query selector. So that means I'm looking on a class. So that should be a query selector, should be thinking about a class, right? And so the form.add event listener submit function in the event, and then the alerts will pop up, submit clicked. Now here we're in the body. Now remember, all of this isn't still, this is in between. This is in between the head and the body. That's different, isn't it? That's different. We added this script in between the head and the body. Now in the body, we have the form method, we post, we have the action. Label, input type, username, type, name, and submit. So remember, we are submitting this query selector. So we're passing in form. This is the form that it's talking about right here. So it's going after that element, right? I said it's a class, but it's going after this element right here. Now follow along as we add validation. So go to your file, open this up in the directory, and for the following instructions to add validation to the above example. Now here, to validate what the user has typed, we can get a reference to the input element in the DOM and check the value property of each. Let's change the submit event handler to display the value of the username input in an alert box. To do that, we are going to use document.query selector, and we're going to select this input user names because we're passing it like an array. We need the access modifier, this bracket notation, and we want this key value pair, name and username, which uses an attribute selector to select the input. So remember the attribute selector, which is that has the name username. So here again, it's our window.add event listener, the load query selector, form, then we add event listener submit function, event, we're passing the event. This can be you don't have to type out the word event, you can just be you'll see that a lot, just to represent event. Let username input document dot query selector. This time we want the input and we want the key value pair of the username that we're going to pass in, and then alert username, and then we're going to concatenate username input dot value. So here it is right here, and we're going to add the value. You want to play around with this. I'm encouraging to play around with this, get an understanding. You're not going to understand this by doing it just one time. You're going to have to do this multiple times, different scenarios, to really understand how this works. Alert the input values when submitted. Now that we know how to get the value of an input, we can add conditional statements. Let's add code that opens an alert box if either input value is empty. So here we're running our conditional right here. So we're adding a conditional if username input that value is strictly equal to an empty string, or team name that value is strictly equal to an empty string. Then we run this. Now we remember what the rule is. If it's or, only one of these have to be true in order for this to run. All fields are required. What does that mean? That if this is empty and this is not empty, then this is still going to pop. If this is empty and this is not empty and this is empty, this is going to alert you. But if they're both has something in it, this is not going to be true. So this condition won't run. We are making progress. Now, if you click submit with one or both of the inputs empty, then an alert message appears telling you that both inputs are required. However, the form is still submitted even if the data is invalid. Now, this is where we got to put this prevent form submission. That little event.prevent default, this is where this comes in. We should prevent the form submission from happening until all inputs have valid values. We can use the event parameter and event.prevent default to stop the form submission. Event.prevent default prevents default browser functionality from happening, like form submissions when button tags are clicked inside of a form. Remember that event handler functions are passed an event argument, which represents the event that the handler is responding to. So here we go. We're going to create that again. We're going to create that condition. So if this is not true, stop the form submission. This is almost like our return right here. Once it hits a return, it stops. Well, event prevent default means let it stop. This is a method. We want it to stop. We don't want it to submit. So when you don't want something to continue to move forward, you're going to use the event.prevent default. You want it to stop processing. This will make more sense when we practice more and use it in real world applications. But for now, play around with this code, try different scenarios, get an understanding of how this works. All right, check your understanding. Now we made it to the end of this particular chapter. So again, go on and do the exercise, and then you're going to work on the studio. So it's so important that you bring all this together, play around with this code, because this is just going to make you a better understand what's going on, and it's going to build your confidence. So again, remember, the more you do, the more you improve. See you in the next chapter.